A typhoon flypast has taken place over Loch Ness to mark the spot where a Wellington bomber ditched nearly 80 years ago. One crew member was killed in the incident. Now a campaign's underway to ensure the aircraft's story is never forgotten. Here's Nicola McCalley.
When the engine cut out, I realised that there was no possibility of getting back to base. The aircraft was losing height.
Memories of how a giant of military aviation met a watery end on New Year's Eve 1939. Wellington bomber pilot David Marwood Elton was forced to ditch his aircraft on Loch Ness almost 8 decades ago after a training exercise ended in tragedy. One crewman, Sergeant John Fensham, died after bailing out.
We were flying at 8,000 feet and the weather conditions were snow squalls. As luck would have it, spotted Loch Ness through a break in the clouds.
The wreckage lay undisturbed for nearly 50 years before it was discovered by chance by American Nessie hunters in 1976, and it was raised to the surface a decade later. Adrian Shine helped survey the spot at the time. Today he returned with a marker.
You could see the engines, you could see the gun turrets, as well as the damage that had happened to it. And so it's quite fascinating, and it's nearly 40 years ago for me.
A commemoration campaign's underway to mark 80 years since the Wellington ditched. Today an airborne tribute came in the form of a typhoon flypast from the base the World War II bomber belonged to, RAF Lossiemouth. A lay-by looks over the spot, its plaque tended by former headmaster Ian Benzie, whose pupils were captivated by the story.
They were given the responsibility of finding out from the actual people, the pilot, his wife, the Robin Holmes and the Loch Ness Wellington Association.
The Wellington bomber, nicknamed R for Robert, now resides in the Brooklands Museum in Surrey, and a film's being made to recount the tale of when this monster landed in Loch Ness.
If it hadn't been for interest in Nessie and people doing a Nessie hunt, I've probably never been found. Like many aircraft that crashed during the war, have long since forgotten, this one lives on.
Nearly 80 years after she ditched here on a dark winter's night, the story of the Wellington bomber continues to live on. And those involved in this project say they're determined that this legend of Loch Ness will be marked for many years to come. Nicola McCalley, STV News.
Hello and welcome to BMtv video, podcasts and radio. I'm Tim Morris, and today we're going to be talking about Arthur Robert, our prize Wellington. If you visit the museum, you go into the aircraft factory, and it is the main thing that you'll see when you get in there. A very important aircraft, and we're going to be talking with 3 people today. We've got Jack Waterfall, we've got Rachel Kellett, and we've got Vic Attwood, and they're all from the Loch Ness Wellington 2020 project. But we're going to begin the story with Arthur Robert, which is the only surviving Wellington that actually saw active service, and it's the only surviving one that was built at Brooklands itself. So I'm going to ask Rachel what her connection is with the Wellington, and talk a little bit about the main battle that it was involved in, which was the Battle of Heligoland39. So over to Rachel for a little history lesson.
Right, well, thank you very much. The story actually begins just before the Second World War. I'm here because I'm the niece of Richard Kellett, who was the squadron leader for the Battle of Heligoland Blight, and he was chosen as a squadron leader because of the just before the Battle of Heligoland Blight, he led something called the long distance flight from Ismailia in Egypt to Darwin, Australia, not flying Wellingtons but flying Wellesleys, also built by Vickers. On November the 8th, 1938, the RAF launched an attempt on the Soviet Union's non-stop long-distance record of 6,000 miles. And he successfully, in formation again, with 3 aircraft, 2 successfully landed and beat the record. So for that reason, he was promoted really and led as a squadron leader the Battle of Heligoland, which was the first air battle of the Second World War. It was a strange battle because they were under very, very strict instructions. When the War Cabinet were anxious to obtain the sinking of German ships, but our objective was simple, but silly, according to Richard. No civilian may be killed or injured, and only naval ships could be attacked at sea. We were virtually forbidden to drop our bombs on land. And if a man transgressed from this ruling, punishment was quite severe. They set off 24 Wellingtons in 4 battle flights from Mildenhall, led by Wing Commander Kellett, my uncle Richard. They approached Heligoland from the north, turned south, saw warships at anchor, but faced considerable flak both from the batteries on the islands and the warships. The Wellingtons released their bombs, and hits claimed 1 cruiser and 2 trawlers, and 1 flank battery was damaged. However, some 4 Messerschmitts were scrambled, and the Luftwaffe successfully were fought off by some turret gunners. And according to Richard, they escaped in a cloud before 8 following Messerschmitts could intercept. The same happened, I think, in Wilhelmshaven the following day. Whether it was a successful battle is, I think the best thing to say about it, enormous lessons were learned. And this was a daylight flight. And there were no daylight flight battles after this. We were kind of sitting targets. Tim Harris, who's the son of Paul Harris, who was one of the leaders of this battle, spoke about it very well. Is that sufficient to know about Heligoland, or would you like to know more?
Yeah, I mean, what happened after the raid? Did they all survive the raid? Did they all come back in one piece, or what happened?
I think that Fly Past magazine said this action engineered in Bomber Command a false sense of optimism, since the self-defending bomber theory now appeared to have been proved. So Wilhelmshaven took place the following day. And there were many more fatalities. Out of 22 planes, 12 were shot down. And this is a quote from Richard. It was a complete farce, he said. We had no self-sealing tanks. That was another point that Paul Harris made. And silly First World War chaff guns, hopeless against the heavy flak that we received. The good thing is that we got rid of the CNC. Now, I don't have the statistics. I think Jack might have, of those that survived and those that didn't.
If we actually look at the sequence of the Battle of Heligoland night, we had 24 Wellingtons taken off from 3 airfields in East Anglia. Squadron 149 from Mildenhall, Squadron 9 from Honington, and Squadron 37 from Feltwell. 2 of the Mildenhall flight had to return to base because one had developed engine trouble early and another one escorted him back. And then the 22 went in to Heligoland Bight. I don't think the RAF were aware that the Germans had got fairly advanced freer radar on the island of Bangaruga, but they had. And when they got to the point where they actually flew out to Bangaruga and then headed south towards Wilhelmshaven, the actual operator on Vangeruga reported to the base at Jever, and they didn't believe him. They said, you know, you must be plotting seagulls on your screens. You know, the Tommies wouldn't come on a day like this because it was just broad daylight. But there they were. And of course, the carnage that ensued, those, I think there must have been at least 10 of that formation shot down into the sea within 30 minutes. We then had 2 aircraft damaged, and as mentioned earlier, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and they had to ditch on the way. They didn't make it back to England, and they both ditched one ditched about 50 miles off Grimsby, the other 50 miles off Cromer. And Tim Harris told me the tale of his father, who was second in command on that raid, escorting his friend Bryden, who was in one of the wounded Wellingtons, who had to ditch 50 miles off Cromer. And he could see the actual fuel streaming down the wings. And so Bryden came to, you know, his engines stopped. He glided down, and Paul Harris followed him down to make sure that he'd ditched safely, which he had. And also, he assumed that his dinghy had been damaged. So he attempted to deploy his own dinghy in flight, which it wasn't designed to do, you know, and it became tangled round his tailplane. And he then had a very shaky ride back to land and managed to touch down at Coltishall. The other one that ditched, that was, the pilot was rather clever on that one, because he ditched in sight of a trawler, because he knew that North Sea, in the coldest winter for more than 3 decades, he'd got 15 minutes to survive if he landed in the water as a human being. And so he obviously said, well, we've got to land within 15 minutes of this trawler. And in that case, the whole crew got rescued by the trawler and taken back to hospital in Grimsby. We had 1 death. The rear gunner was lost, Walter Lilly. And also Ronnie Driver, Minnie Driver's father, was 18 years old. And the more I read about his circumstances was that everybody else in the aircraft was badly injured. And that was through his bravery and, you know, his ability, you know, to be mobile, that he managed to get the dinghy upside and get the surviving crew into that dinghy, and they survived. You know, and you know, what we're actually seeing in our research and in all these little details that we find more and more of, you know, we are in touch with the real human cost of this activity. And in the case of Ronnie Driver, 18, very traumatized, obviously, and he actually went into a psychiatric unit in Matlock first, and then, ironically, once he managed to get out of there, he was put into RAF Littleport. And RAF Littleport was the forerunner hospital before the RAF Hospital Ely. So, you know, we can see those same buildings in these parts today. And he managed to actually recover a year after that battle. And he was, you know, he then managed to, you know, come back, and he did survive the war and rose to high, you know, quite a high rank in the RAF over time.
One thing we didn't, or I didn't make clear why we're mentioning Paul Harris, is it was Paul Harris who was flying Arthur Robert in both of those battles,
Absolutely.
Heligoland and Wilhelmshaven. And he came back, Tim calls it the luck of the Harrises, because he survived the whole war with many other flights, but that was the aircraft that Paul Harris was pilot of in both of those battles. So Arthur Robert was fighting in both of those battles.
Lovely, thank you. Did you get a chance to speak to your uncle Richard in person about the battle at all?
Yes, I did. I only met Richard really at the end of his life. He was one of 5 children, one of them my father, who I never knew. So coming to know Richard was very beautiful for me, and he was obviously like the father that I'd never met. And he'd had a very, very colourful life. He'd done this long distance flight from Ismailia in Egypt, as I said, to Darwin, where I recently visited and saw a demonstration of that. He was involved in Heligoland. He was taken prisoner and landed up in Stanislav, and was senior British officer there for the various escapes that took place.
Okay.
Yeah, very colourful and a very interesting and self-deprecating man.
Thank you. Moving back to Arthur Robert, now I know it took part in a few other missions before the incident on Hogmanay in December 1940. I don't know if we can move to Vic. Perhaps you could tell us what happened.
I've come into this because Tim Harris has already been mentioned, whose father's aircraft it was. I've known Tim for about 40 years. I'm actually a civil aviation person from Heathrow and Gatwick originally, although I now live in Inverness. In fact, I know Brooklands and some of the exhibits you've got there quite well. But when this came up about the remembrance of Arthur Robert in the Inverness area, because Tim knew I was here, he co-opted me, as it were, onto the group for my local knowledge of the Inverness area. But I'd met Tim many times, and I'd seen Arthur Robert at Brooklands, and I was fully aware of the background story to it. But I was here in Inverness and more involved in what's going on currently rather than the historical side of it.
If you like, I can read you the story or I can tell you the story of what happened that New Year's Eve. Would that be useful? N2980, which is Arthur Robert, was transferred to training duties at Lossiemouth. On New Year's Eve in 1940, pilot squadron leader Marwood Elton and pilot officer Slater took off in the late afternoon with a crew of 6, including some trainee navigators. After taking off from Lossiemouth, the snowstorm increased, and one of the Wimpeys, which is another name for the Wellingtons, 2 engines failed. Flying Arthur Robert became increasingly challenging. Losing height, Marwood Elton ordered the crew, including the trainee navigators, to bail out, and 5 of the crew bailed out successfully, but the rear gunner, Sergeant Fensom's parachute failed to open, and he died, sadly. All the others landed safely. So with just the squadron leader and the co-pilot on board, Marwood Elton and his co-pilot Slater fought to keep her aloft. Seeing a large stretch of water, they skillfully brought the Wimpey down and ditched in the ice-cold loch. The 2 pilots were able to get out on the wing, where they launched their inflatable rubber dinghy and paddled ashore. They landed right next to the A82 road, where a truck gave them a lift to nearby Inverness, just in time, it turned out, for both men to join the New Year's Eve celebrations. Meanwhile, Arthur Roberts sank 230 feet into the bottom of Loch Ness.
And that's where it stayed for some 40 odd years. What happened then in the early 80s? Perhaps
Well, I
Jack,
can say something about
Vic?
the dishing, if I may, Tim.
Yeah.
The early Wellingtons, you could not feather the propellers. So when you had an engine failure, it became an almighty drag on the aircraft. That's why they were unable to maintain altitude. If they'd had a more modern aircraft, or even a later model of the Wellington, where you could feather the props, they would have probably been able to got back to Lossiemouth.
Yeah. And on that point, one thing I find fascinating is that the men who were flying the Wellington loved the Wellington and believed, and I guess it was true, at the time it was leading edge technology. But the point Vic has just made, the Pegasus 1A engine was, early 1930s technology. And therefore, that was already out of date, but there was nothing better at the time. And then Tim made the point the other day. He said, at that time, the Wellington was the only thing we had, to defend our country. It was the best thing. So, and then obviously following on from that, the rate of technological change was very fast.
Yeah, absolutely. So it lay at the bottom of the loch for 40 or 41 years, I think it was.
Yeah.
So what led to the discovery of it there?
Well, if I may, I'll just take over the story, because I've been trying to deal with the Americans on the early part of this thing, which has proved to be quite challenging over many months. There was a character called Robert Rhines from Boston. He was a patent lawyer and quite wealthy, and I think he was actually he was a Nessie fanatic. He wanted to find Nessie, and he came over more than once. And in 1976, he brought over a young sonar expert called Marty Klein, and Marty Klein and his team were doing a geological survey with their sonar. And in the 1976 visit, it wasn't until they got back to America and analysed their traces that they realised that they'd picked up this Wellington. And there is some confusion whether they thought that was a Wellington, because there are reports that some thought it was a Catalina. Anyway, they came back in 78 and got an improved image, and indeed it was a Wellington. And the problem was, of course, in 1978, it was then sort of common knowledge where it was. So the time Robin Holmes arrived on the scene in the early 80s, there was a fair bit of vandalism that had gone on. Trawlers with grappling hooks and all sorts had vandalised the old Wellington. And his big worry was that, we've got to get on and recover this Wellington, because there's going to be nothing left. And so there were various dives. So there is quite a lot of underwater footage, which we have in our possession now, of those early dives in 81. And then obviously Robin managed to get the Loch Ness Wellington Association together, which its membership included Richard Kellett and Paul Harris, and they did the lifting in September 1985, and that wasn't easy either, because that wasn't straightforward. They had a few little disasters, but they did manage to land it on the 21st of September 1985. And I think there was quite a large team of enthusiasts from Brooklands, which were probably related to British Aerospace, who were there, looking through that wreckage and studying the parts. And obviously being from British Aerospace, were probably very familiar with those parts. And the wreckage was washed down, loaded onto articulated lorries and driven 560 miles down to Weybridge, where it is now.
It couldn't be a better place for it, where it came from initially, of course. There was a massive undertaking to restore the aircraft, probably for the next 10 years or so, involving around 70 different companies were involved in the restoration, but largely by engineering apprentices and volunteers did the majority of the work on it. So it's absolutely fantastic effort to get it into the condition that we do see it today. But let's go back briefly to Heligoland again. Now, as a result of that, I believe the Heligoland39 project was set up, and I think Jack has some knowledge of that. Perhaps you can tell us what that was about.
Well, I mentioned one thing leading to another. My cousin did a fairly in-depth bit of research relating to our family, because we had lost an uncle in a Wellington in July 1940, 3 days before the Battle of Britain started. And our family is a little bit, well, I wouldn't say peculiar, but different, in as much as we were smallholders on a farm 6 miles from RAF Feltwell. My uncle was born in 1918, so he was at the beginning of the war. He was 20 odd, and quite a bright boy, but obviously had been born into the Great Depression. He was searching for a better life, and he used to spend time in Feltwell at weekends playing football with the RAF men there. And he was then, he enlisted in the RAF in January 1939. And he flew his first mission in January 1940. And he was dead July 1940. And I think that's a common sort of scenario for many families. But the difference with our family was, there we were still living and farming 6 miles from Feltwell. So me, being born in 1949, I was born into a community which remembered my uncle. You know, you'd see somebody in the village and say, well, I used to play football with him, you know. Whereas I think that's quite uncommon, because most airmen would have been hundreds of miles from their home and wouldn't have had that emotional connections. So you take me and my cousin, so we were fed with these stories from many people from our community. Our grandfather was like many old people, that they just didn't want to talk about the war. So we didn't have an accurate picture of what happened. But anyway, to cut a long story short, we found the wreckage in a forest near Yava, and we commemorated that loss with the erection of a memorial by the commander of RAF Yava in 2016. And this is where the one thing leads to another. When we were leaving Yava airfield, I was given a poster, a copy of a poster which all these Wellingtons were being shot into the sea. And that was a German propaganda painting depicting the Battle of Heligoland Bight. And me and my partners in the early project had actually managed to find all the families of the other 4 aircrew that were in my uncle's Wellington. And I said to them, well, when we got back and we looked a bit more into the Battle of Heligoland Bight, and we realized there was 127 families involved, they were a little bit aghast when I suggested we go in a worldwide search for 157 families. But they were persuaded eventually to do that. And the Heligoland39 project, we actually managed to celebrate the beginning of the 80th anniversary year at Ely Cathedral and the actual 80th anniversary of the battle at the RAF Memorial at Runnymede, followed by excellent afternoon tea and cake at Brooklands.
Fantastic. So you managed to track down how many of these relatives?
I think Rachel will correct me. I think in Ely we had I think we had over 82 relatives, you know, and obviously among them there were, well, that is another reality of this business. Obviously, where you had families where their young airmen had survived, those families were big, but you had a lot of families who were no longer existent because their line had been destroyed, and you know, way back in '39. But we did manage on both occasions to get 80 odd relatives to those events, and I think the icing on the cake was the actual meeting at Brooklands, because we took over the Vicar's Suite there, and the atmosphere on the 8th, well, it's a year ago tomorrow, isn't it, that we were at Brooklands?
Yes.
Yeah, a year ago tomorrow. But the atmosphere there was just electric, you know.
Could I just interject there and say my grateful thanks to Jack for doing this, because through this I met Tim Harris, the son of Paul Harris, and this is what I found he said. This was his speech. Kellett arrived just in time, one of the RAF's most brilliant pilots. He led the world's long distance record, leading 3 Welsleys from Egypt to Australia. He's one of a small handful of young senior officers in the group capable of leading formation. He led brilliantly on the Wilhelmshaven raid, and we survived because of him. So imagine, you know, how lovely, how wonderful that is for me to hear. Richard would never say anything like that. You know, he was a kind of self-deprecating man. So to hear from Paul the words of his father about Richard were very, very touching. So that was a great highlight for me.
Well, yeah, and also another reality of their situation, they actually knew what they were doing, you know, Richard and Paul, because, you know, they'd flown since the mid-30s, hadn't they? They knew what they were doing, and they knew the Wellington technology, but their big problem was their commanders were of the World War I generation and hadn't got a clue, you know. So it was a difficult sort of management problem there early in Bomber Command, and everybody had to learn very quickly.
That's true. So you're talking about how one thing led to another, and we had the Heligoland39 project, which I guess culminated really in December 2019 with the events you've been talking about. So how did that lead on to the next project, the Loch Ness Wellington 2020?
Well, Tim Harris actually visited me in Ely several times, you know, in the lead up to all this. I think he first came over in October 2018. And Tim, by profession, is a pig breeder. And here in Ely, we happen to have a world famous pork butcher who makes excellent sausages. And so me and Tim had a common interest in consuming the bangers and mash together. And that began a relationship. And he was then filling me in on Paul Harris's link with Arthur Robert. And I guess, you know, we realized that this 80th anniversary of the ditching was, you know, in the pipeline, and we said, should we do something about this, you know, just to finish off? And therefore, I think we've got to credit Tim with actually sort of sparking this little idea off. And then if you move to Inverness, Vic has served a really good purpose in connecting the project with all sorts of people, all sorts of useful people up in Inverness. And but I think we're finding the enthusiasm for all this up in Inverness sort of tremendous, really. That for me, that is becoming the reward. We had this lovely Scottish TV presentation, and that happened on the when did we fly the Typhoon, Vic? That was the 28th of October, wasn't it?
Yeah, I know it was towards the end of October.
Yeah, 28th of October. 9 Squadron had organised for a Typhoon Eurofighter to do a fly past, you know, and Scottish TV covered it. And Nicola McAlley, who was the presenter on that programme, put the emphasis on Arthur Robert being a Loch Ness legend. And I think that is true, really.
Could I just add the kind of connection with Vic, who, because of COVID, we are unable to go up there ourselves and to travel. Vic has been invaluable with many trips to the Loch Ness, or the Wellington lay-by, as we like to call it, and arranging for a service, a pre-recorded service in Inverness Cathedral, and finding all the local people who were involved, including the local school teacher, Ian Benzie, whose children were involved in the 1985 salvage by creating a play.
They were given the responsibility of finding out from the actual people, the pilot, his wife, the Robin Holmes and the Loch Ness Wellington Association.
You mentioned Scottish TV film, The Typhoon, which must have been quite something to see. What's happened to that film, and are there any future plans to include it in anything else?
Well, I think we've got lots of good footage of that Typhoon, and that will come in because we want to, because Squadron 9, the significance of Squadron 9, or sorry, I should say 9 Squadron to be correct in RAF lingo. They are the only squadron of the 3 that went to Heligoland that is still operational. You know, they're a bomber squadron with the modern, so that's right that they should be included. But obviously, they're very busy, and I think we were dead lucky to get that Typhoon to fly over. You know, because they've obviously got to be on guard for the Rushkies coming down and whatever else they're ordered to do. But we have got some good footage captured, and yeah.
And all of these will be linked to the web page, so that the web page will link to all of the old footage and the present footage.
Yeah.
That's we've acted like a kind of repository of the information so far, including the interviews and radio interviews of that time, and photographs, and first-hand accounts are all on the web pages, which we're very much hoping Brooklands might like to take over.
Do you have anything planned specifically for the actual anniversary day, which I believe is New Year's Eve?
Yes, we do. We've had a service prepared at the cathedral, done in advance because of COVID, but that will be released on New Year's Eve, as I understand it, at exactly that time, at 3 o'clock at the time of the ditching. And Vic, do you want to say a bit about Ian Benzie and the school children?
Yes, Ian Benzie was headmaster of a school on the Black Isle, which is just north of Inverness. When the recovery became known, his school children took it on as a project. And apart from being there physically when it happened, they did a play which radio play, which actually went out on the local radio station at the time. And there are copies of that play as well. And one of the young girls, an 11-year-old, actually wrote a poem about the whole, it's literally the history of Arthur Robert, from its inception by Barnes Wallis down to its final home at Brooklands. And that was in fact the 11-year-old that actually wrote it is now 45-year-old, but she couldn't come to the Inverness actually for the service to reread her own poem. So we had two young girls from the local cathedral school, which is obviously attached to the cathedral where we were, and they recited the poem.
Okay, and again, looking to the future, we're talking about things linking together. Is there anything on the horizon in the future?
Yes, once the epidemic and that is over, hopefully there will be an exhibition in the museum at Inverness, probably for approximately a 3-month period. And then near Lossiemouth, actually at Kinloss, there is an aviation museum that specialises in the Murray Firth area and operations in the Murray Firth area. And we hope it's going to Moravia, which also has got a website that's referred to on our website as a permanent exhibit.
That'll be great. Up in the area itself. Is there any likelihood of any TV programs or books coming out of it?
Well, there is a diary day already in the Brooklands diary for us to meet at Brooklands on the 24th of September 2021. And that will be the sort of final day of what we hope will be a 5-day UK and international tour, starting up in the Highlands on the 20th of September, cruising Loch Ness on the 21st of September, which will be the anniversary of the lifting. Next year, that'll be the 36th anniversary of the lifting. And then we're going to land up in Brooklands for a nice little lunch on the Friday at the end of that week. And so I'm hoping to persuade some of the Americans to come over, plus our contacts in Wilhelmshaven. So we've got a German element, and anybody who is really linked to Arthur Robert in terms of the families that we've found in the previous projects.
So again, back to the future projects, I understand there's going to be a little bit of money involved. How are we actually funding that?
Well, we have a challenge in as much as we want to make a very good quality film documentary about this history. And we also want to erect a commemorative plaque. And we think we're going to need a budget in the region of £15,000 to £20,000 to do something really nice. Unfortunately, most of that money will be needed for the film, and films are not eligible for lottery funding. And therefore, we have got really to launch a very effective crowdfund campaign. But bearing in mind of the area we're covering, we're covering North America, UK, a bit of mainland Europe. At the moment, the promotion for seeking our 20,000 is on the basis, look, we only need £4,005 notes to do this. Please help us. And so we are, we're trying to tease a few people into backing us. And I think, have we almost got 10% of what we need now, Rachel?
Yes, I think we have. Yes, it's the crowdfund page is the Just Giving page. Yeah, it's on the website. If you want to go to it, you're welcome.
So a person clicking onto that QR code, and I've actually recently just put the QR code reader on my smartphone, and I'm having a job, you know, being sort of born in the first half of last century, I'm having a job with all this technology. But this QR code business is just fantastic, because you click on our donate QR code, you see the picture of Rachel, and you can either donate immediately by impulse or read what Rachel's saying about why we need the money. So
I hope you see Arthur Robert.
Yeah, great. So if people go to Loch Ness Wellington2020.org, look for the crowdfunding section, QR code on there, and the rest should be quite easy. So good luck with your fundraising.
If I may add another bit about the current situation on Loch Ness regarding Arthur Robert, Jacobite Cruises, who run the tour boats on the loch, mainly for overseas tourists, on their boats, which are quite large, in the sort of cafeteria area, on the tables is a map of Loch Ness, and marked on that map is the point where the aircraft was recovered and where it crashed. Also, they mention it in their commentary when they're doing their cruise to the loch. So it lives on with every cruise 2 or 3 times a day on Loch Ness.
Now that's great to hear, and it's great to hear that people like yourselves are trying to keep the memory alive as well. Of course, that's what we're doing at Brooklands, with it being the centrepiece of our aircraft factory exhibition. And it's available to be seen every day that the museum's open, of course. So I'd like to thank Rachel, Vic, and Jack for a very interesting story about Arthur Robert. Thank you.
Thank you.